Well, I'll introduce myself, I guess, first, and so then at least you have some context. I sort of come from property, I suppose. I originally property sourcing, and I kind of lapsed into the stamp duty stuff, and the stuff being working out how to reclaim it, and then I started reclaiming it for our clients, and it worked, and then we started building networks and so on. And now there are 15 of us in the business, and we are charging along. And I think I put that down to really tight processes, good case arguments, and a really great team, actually. So the thing I want to talk about is your rights, in fact, and your right to assess your property as non-residential if circumstances allow it. And the other part of it is ways of reducing your stamp duty liability legitimately. So in the world of tax, as unexciting as it is, because it is profoundly hard work for most people, it's associated with pain, like pain of giving away money that you've earned. I appreciate that. But this is a different story, because this is about how you can reduce that liability or get some of that money that you expected to never see again back. As part of my journey to understand the topic, I wrote a couple of books, and I've got them here. And so the first one is the Land Tax Guide, and it's a massive book. It's 702 pages long. It's got a ton of stuff in it. And, some people go do a course in this. There isn't a course in doing stamp duty reclaims. And I didn't want to become an accountant. And so I thought the best thing to do is just write the book. And so this is going to be published probably September. I also have an addendum to that, which is 300 pages of case law and all that juiciness. And again, the idea is, if I can teach it, I know it. If I know it, I can help people understand it. And then the world is a better place. Certainly for the people that care to learn and want to know their rights in this matter. I have a short book, which is 200 and something pages, 206 pages. And this one is for you. So anyone who's here today, you can have a copy. Either register on the website and there'll be a link on the presentation, or ask Steve, he'll give you a copy of this. It'll be on a PDF. It's just going to have the essentials. And if you're really that interested in totally nerding out, sure, have the full vanilla 1,000-page monster book and help yourself. It is probably, there's a lot of information in it. Okay, now to keep it simpler though, what I've done is I've just set up this little presentation, and the idea is to just go through a few essentials that I hope you care about, and or more to the point, I hope that you care about. Like, I hope I get it right, and I nail the things that mean most to you. I think the number one thing is you have rights that you probably don't know about, and by going through this with me, you'll begin to understand what these rights are. And as property people, it's going to help you, especially if you're in the world of residential property. We all know what stamp duty is, obviously. And the weird thing about stamp duty is it's actually quite a complex tax. There are lots of stamp duty reliefs, and they're listed here. So for example, this is a list of various reliefs, which is on HMRC guidance about the SDLT1, which is a form that your conveyancer will complete on your behalf when you purchase a property. Anyway, lots of reliefs, but in reality, not many for any normal property person. But there is a couple of things in there which I think you'll find helpful, and we'll talk about that in some detail. The next thing is that when we think about liability, a way of looking at it is there are, as I said, reliefs, there are exemptions, reclassifications. And what are these? Well, a relief is a discount on your stamp duty. So, for example, a really nice stamp duty relief is if you're a first-time buyer, then you don't pay any stamp duty up to, I think, £425,000 or thereabouts. So that's a nice relief. There used to be another one called multiple dwellings relief, which when engineered properly, was a very tax efficient way of assessing property deals. So, for example, you might have a block of apartments, say 5 units, and you would assess and each unit's 100,000 or 200,000, whatever the number is, and we'll call it 200,000, and therefore 5 units, it's £1 million for the whole lot. You used to be able to assess it so that you would pay the stamp duty on each of the £200,000 units, and in aggregate your liability would be lower than it is now, where you are going to have to pay stamp duty on the whole £1 million. Anyway, that relief has been abolished recently as of June 1st. The next thing is exemptions, and this is where, for example, let's say there's a divorce. That's a sad situation, and a court says divorce done. Then if property is transferred in that circumstance, there's no stamp duty payable. Same as with probate. So you're not paying stamp duty when you inherit that property because there's an exemption. So far, not much here for property people, really. There are a couple of things I'll talk about later, but reclassifications is the big one. And this is where properties are assessed as residential, and then they're reclassified as mixed use or non-residential. And this is where the action is. If you're thinking about reducing stamp duty liability, it's here. And we'll go into it in a bit more depth. The idea is that property is so when we talk about all this, the whole thing is to go as far upstream as possible. So what I always like to do is look at the legislation, and even though it's in very difficult to navigate English, once you get used to it, it all kind of makes sense and starts to work. And there are provisions in the Finance Act 2003 where they talk about a dwelling and what a dwelling is. And if you can argue that a property is not a dwelling, technically speaking, then it's not somewhere where you can reside. If you can't reside in it, then it shouldn't be assessed as residential. So there's a very simple notion, which is if a dwelling, residential rates; if not a dwelling, not residential rates. And if not residential rates, then you're paying less stamp duty, a lot less. If you're buying take a typical like buy-to-let property, £150,000, then if purchased as an investor, you're paying 3% higher rate stamp duty on that, which is £4,500. And let's say you're foreign national as well, then it's another 2%. So that's, I think, £7,500 total. But non-residential rates of stamp duty are zero up to that. And I'll just show you this calculator. I'll just make it bigger. So I'll put in a number. Can someone give me a figure for a property? Just a number that resonates with you, like 300,000 or something like that. Anyone?
I was going to say 275,000.
Okay, that sounds like an apartment in the south of England.
Yes.
Okay, I'm just going to do 0 success fees because this is not relevant here. And here we go. So the stamp duty, if you're an investor, you're going to have to pay £9,500. But If it's assessed as non-residential, then it's £3,250. Big difference. And you can see here the splits and how it all works. This is meaningful. And because you can't mortgage up stamp duty, it's really meaningful for cash flow. Just saying. Right. So getting back to the presentation, this whole business about, right. So now we'll talk about how you can reduce liability, and we'll give some examples and so on. So I think the first thing is this condition hazards issue. So for this, I'm just going to pick out a random property. So on the website, we've got about 170 case studies, something like that. And so with assessing as non-residential due to condition, I've written a long article where where is it? Sorry. Yeah, here it is, this one. This goes into it in great detail. It's about 5,500 words, but it talks about the law, goes into the case law, and explains how it all fits together. But on a very high level, if a property can never be reused because it's so derelict, then how could you say that it can be a dwelling? It will never be a dwelling because, let's say it's an old house with loads of asbestos in it, and in any event, it has to be demolished because you're going to do a new build on it. That property will justifiably be assessed as non-residential. And the reason for that is that there was a court case with PN Bewley, who were a developer, and HMRC, and they successfully argued against HMRC and said, we're going to demolish this. It's never going to be a property, therefore, never going to be a dwelling. Therefore, we're going to assess as non-residential. Now, when HMRC do their guidance, what they say, and this is a really important point, by the way, whenever you're considering what HMRC tell you, always remember that if it involves tax take on their side, they'll be very clear about it. If it involves tax loss, don't expect the same clarity. And I'm forthright about this because there was a whole thing that happened fairly recently where they changed their guidance, not because the law changed, not because, well, actually because they lost a court case. And therefore they thought, well, we better cover that one up. I'm pretty sure of that. Now, you know, if someone from HMRC might argue this, but the point I'm going to get to is that with classifying these properties, there are really two stories. Is it derelict? This is what they say here. Can never be rebuilt. You go, okay, well, and it is a very small number of properties. But what they don't talk about is the guidance that they removed recently is this idea that if there are hazards in a property that would theoretically restrict it legally from use, then that they accept that that's not habitable. And the reason is that because there's loads of case law, there's a case law argument that basically accepts that if a property isn't legally usable as a dwelling, it's not a dwelling, like a garage or an office or somewhere that you just don't live. That means that has legal restrictions for its use as a dwelling, i.e. you just can't live there. And this is where the action is on this front. So I'm going to talk about this, then I'll talk about mixed use, which is also really interesting. On this, I'll just talk about the language first, and then we'll talk about the hazards, and then we can talk about how this whole thing pulls together. What they're saying is these hazards present, because the local authority, what they're talking about are condition hazards as specified by HHSRS guidance. And this is if some of you may have heard about this, for example, the Home Fitness for Habitation Act is based on this guidance. So the standards for habitation that a property must have, it's based on this guidance. And there are like 29 different condition hazards. And if a property has these hazards, then under the Finance Act, the Homes Act 2004, Section 20, amazing I can remember any of this, but here we are. This stuff, and remembering, if you go far up enough, if you go all the way upstream, look at the legislation, then you get more clarity, and then you can kind of work your way downstream. But this bit of legislation is really interesting in that it gives local authorities huge power to issue prohibition notices on properties and therefore render them uninhabitable, technically speaking, or uninhabitable. They can legally restrict their use. And it's not just what they call category 1 hazards, which are very serious, like toxic mold or dangerous electrics or whatever. There are category 2 hazards, which are things like old carpets, trip hazards, things like that. Anyway, the arguments that we put forth, which I've explained in a lot of detail here, if you want to nerd up on this, are really around the idea of condition hazards. So we've got a regular house and it's got damp and there's a fire safety issue with this window. You can't get out of it. If you've read enough surveys, you will have seen these kind of comments from a typical RICS level 2 surveyor. They'll say you can't escape from the, inadequate fire escape, basically. And we've got a chimney stack that's just not very safe because there's vegetation growing in it and the pointing could go and the thing could collapse theoretically. So what we're looking for when we assess a property is, does it have or did it have these condition 1 hazards when purchased? And if it did, then in theory, it could have had a prohibition notice issued by the local authority. And therefore, it's arguable that it could have been legally restricted from use. And therefore, it should not have been assessed as a dwelling by your conveyancing solicitor when they submitted the SDLT1. And what happens is they will send this form and they're going to answer question 1, and they're going to say it is code 1 because it looks like a house. It's got to be a house. And then you argue, are you sure about that? They say, no, it's a house. You've got to pay. It's resident. You've got to pay. And that's the end of it. And then you walk away and you just dropped a load of money and you didn't have to, because your rights say that you can assess that property if it has condition hazards that could merit a prohibition notice by a local authority. Hope that makes some sense. I'm trying to break it down into small chunks. And then there's a question, is this contentious? Well, no, it isn't, because we've done hundreds of these cases and touch wood, got some wood, touch wood, no inquiries yet. Because at some level or another, when you pay the tax and you reclaim the tax, they've made a decision to pay the tax back. And therefore, they tend not to contest many of these cases, only the frivolous ones or the sketchy ones, the ones with the big money. But if it's a typical buy-to-let, 2 up, 2 down, and it's got these condition hazards, you're in a very strong position. So that's that. And the next thing is mixed use, which is quite interesting as well. So it's tied in with this once again. So I'll go back to, oh, by the way, just on the guidance thing, remember I said it's not legally binding on their part, so they can say what they want to say. What did they say? They said, they then listed a bunch of cases which say nothing in particular, just consider these issues here. Well, what does that mean? Nothing. They just put some filler in because they knew very well that this absolutely opened the door for them, just to say. Anyway, there it is. I may sound a bit like I don't know, belligerent. I'm not belligerent. I just think people have their rights and you should know the rights. And it's very easy for HMRC to play a fear, uncertainty, doubt game on everyone and try and cover up the fact that you do have these rights and you should exercise them. Now, the next thing is, oh yeah, I want to talk about mixed use. Very simple idea. I'll just dwell on this slide for a minute. If there are non-residential elements in a property, let's say you buy a unit, and if it's got 5 apartments, then because there's no multiple dwellings relief on it, and it's a residential block, then you're going to have to pay stamp duty for the total. We said £1 million on that property earlier instead of £200,000 each, and then and the liability would have been way lower had there been multiple dwellings relief. If there's a non-residential element, like let's say there's a shop below, shop and uppers, classic, then this is fairly obvious stuff. But it gets less obvious when you start to look at some edge cases, which I'll talk about in a minute. Then the whole building is assessed as non-residential. So it's kind of counterintuitive. You go, well, there's a shop, and then I got 4 floors of residential, 5 floors of residential, 5 units. By the way, if it's 6 or more units, the whole lot is considered non-residential, so you pay non-residential rates of stamp duty. That's why I'm talking about 5 units. Anyway, where it gets more interesting is, for example, if you're a developer and you're buying a plot of land, there's a building on it. Therefore, solicitor is going to say you've got to pay residential rates on that. Sorry. Then what can happen is that, yeah, so you go, okay, fair enough, solicitor, you obviously know what you're talking about. You're the conveyancing solicitor. You know these things. I'm sure you do. I trust you. And you're paying £1 million for this or whatever, then it starts to add up. And I'll just make that £1 million just so we can see a shocking number. It starts to get meaningful, and solicitor says, you pay your 71,250, cheers. But what if there was, say, on an old factory unit on the plot? So you had some houses and you had a factory unit, mixed use. There's this whole thing with blocks of apartments, which is being tested at the moment. And this idea is that if there's non-residential in the block, then everything in the block is assessed as mixed use. Thus, everything in the block is non-residential. So yours truly is going down that rabbit hole at the moment with a couple of big schemes in good old Manchester. That's that. The next thing is for property traders. So if you're one of those people and you flip properties, this might interest you. There's 2 parts to this. Firstly, if you're just flipping like economy properties, 150 grand under, and they need a bit of work, then great, just assess, ideally you pay the stamp duty reclaim. That's the sensible, safe thing to do. But if the property is a wreck, then arguably you could assess as non-residential due to property condition at purchase. Now, if you're trading and you're flipping and you're turning stuff over quite fast, then these small bits of money, they count. So this one's really cool. It's one of the only reliefs that's actually usable. And it's where, for example, if you're buying a property on behalf or from a family, let's say it's a probate estate, so somebody's died and they're selling grandma's house or whatever, then if you purchase that property as a property trader, do it up a bit and then resell it, you don't pay any stamp duty. And then the other scenario is if there's a broken chain and you bought the property, so these are easy to find. So for example, Steve was talking about Property Filter being one of the sponsors. There's also Property Engine. These are really good sites actually. And there are gazillions of properties that have come back on the market, probably because chains have broken. That's usually why it happens. And if you buy that property, do it up, resell it, you're not paying any stamp duty on it. Very cool. Now there are limitations. There are things, the do's and don'ts. One of them is that the maximum you can spend on it to do it up is £10,000, or 5% of the value of the property, up to £20,000. That's for enhancements. Here is a very important point, and it arcs back to pay attention to the legislation, because the answer is usually in there. It's just you got to know where to look. ChatGPT is helpful, by the way, for this kind of stuff. The legislation states that if you're repairing some, I can't remember the exact wording, but it goes along the lines of, if you're fixing damaged items, like dangerous elements within the property, like dangerous electrics, dangerous gas, damp, these kind of things, well, that's not part of the £10,000 enhancement bill. You're just simply spending money to get it to a safe standard, and then the rest of the money is to make it nice. For my own part, me personally, I'm getting a little bit of money fairly soon, and this is what I'm doing. I'm going to be trading, and I'm going to be buying stuff, probably the 250, 300-ish mark, that kind of thing. Probably through broken chains, because that's the most common. And I'm looking for stuff with bad electrics, those kind of issues, where I can add a lot of value, improving the safety standards of the house, and then tosh it up with 10, 15,000 pounds in it just to make it pretty, and then sell it in such a way that, if you want that kitchen, then I'll discount the property a little bit for you, so you can put in whatever kitchen you like, kind of idea. But that way, then I don't have cash flow issues with having to knock out loads of stamp duty, because I'm not paying any, and it gives me that little margin. And because it's trading, I'm recycling the money constantly over an annual period. And actually, every time I do a trade, I'm not paying the stamp duty. It starts to add up. And let's say we talk about a £250,000 property. Well, we talked about 275,000, didn't we, earlier? So let's go back to that number. Therefore, the residential rates would be 9.5. So every time I'm doing a trade, I've got 9.5 grand competitive advantage over the next person. And that's a thing. And there's a client of ours who's a young property developer of the year. She's amazing. And last time I checked in, which was a few months ago with her, we ran a bunch of cases for her, but she had done, I think, 15 over 2 years. And this was her game. Brilliant, 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 brilliant. And I assume she's up to 20 by now, because she's a dynamo. Anyway, that's that one. And it works really well. It's what I'm doing. And also, just generally, if one's buying the other thing to say, I get this quite a lot, owner occupiers over £1 million, property condition issues, hazardous, etc., assess as non-residential, or reclaim as non-residential, but reclaim then by reclassifying as non-residential, that works too. So anything over £1 million for an owner occupier, it works. We've talked about this, and as I say, it works really well for higher value properties. And again, it's about just knowing all the details. So looking at the legislation in my essentials book, I think I talk about this in summary, and in my main book, I go into it in a lot of depth. The next thing is linked transactions, and this one is also super interesting. So, well, I think it is, and hopefully you will too. If you can make money, then you'll be interested, I guess. You're doing a linked transaction, and you've got a choice. You can buy with or without some non-residential. So you decide, I'll buy with some non-residential. Great. The whole lot is assessed as non-residential. Being a linked transaction, it's treated as one single thing. So in other words, you buy 4 properties from somebody, and one of them happens to be non-residential, the whole lot's treated as non-residential. It's not so significant when you're, actually it is significant because there's no multiple dwellings relief any longer. So this is it. This is your way of reducing your liability. And remember, it's not a relief, it's a reclassification, which puts you in a very different place. And also, just to say, if you're claiming reliefs, you've got 1 year to do so. If you're claiming repayment due to reclassification, you've got 4 years because it's not a stamp duty relief. So there's lots of court cases, especially around multiple dwellings relief. There was a big one where 12, I think it was 12 different parties put a case. It ended up on first year tax tribunal, I think it was, and they lost it because you got 12 months to do the assessment and to rectify the error with the relief. Now, I've slagged off conveyancing solicitors. They're great. They're great until they're not great. And if you've ever, on the sourcing side, I've had so many headaches with them. Most solicitors are fine, whatever, but just, we've all had our horror stories. The main thing is, if you say to them, look, I want to assess as non-residential because of the condition, they will probably protest and say, I'm not a tax expert. It's not, don't talk to me about it. Go and talk to a tax expert. And what they're really saying is that because they're highly regulated, they don't want to even go near any sniff of trouble. And therefore, it's really important that you're very explicit with them and that they understand, that you understand what you're doing. Again, read my book. It's all in there. And also look through the website, learn your rights, and then you will know what to do next. The next thing is, and we're nearly there, and it is this idea about just, I'm just saying it again, you know, in neurolinguistic programming or psychology, they say repetition. Repetition, repetition. Right, repetition. Know your rights and understand this whole idea about legally restricted from use and how to look at condition issues, whether they're hazardous or not, and make a judgment on it. If you bought a property you overpaid, how about getting that money back? If you're buying property, then consider assessing as non-residential at purchase, but be prepared. Again, read up on the topic. Okay, and I think that is more or less it. The book is here. So what I suggest you do, actually, so Steve's got a mailer. He'll be back in a minute. I'll ask Steve to email the book to everyone in the PSN group. I think that's the easiest way to do it. So we'll do that, and then you can get your own copy. And from there, you'll become more knowledgeable and better off financially if this is your gig, residential investment. Okay.